Okay, so we're going to start chapter 4 today, and we're going to cover, so there's two parts in chapter 4. Today we're going to do factoring in quadratic forms, and then next class, so next week, we will do square roots, solving using square roots, okay? For this first part of chapter 4 will be split into two sections. You'll do 4-1, part 1, 4-1, part 2, and 4-2, and then we'll review and take a test over that right before Thanksgiving. And then afterwards, we'll finish 4-3, 4-4, 4-5, 4-6. Okay? So for factoring, a lot of this, majority of this will be, or should be, a review from Algebra 1. I know you factored some in geometry, but just a little bit of the simple trinomials. So we'll look at more detailed ones here. Okay? So to start with GCF, that is what you're going to be able to divide each term by. So you're going to look at your numbers and find a GCF between that, and you're going to look at your variables. For your variables, you're going to choose the smallest exponent, because what we're doing is dividing each term. So with your exponent rules, if you had x to the 6th over x to the 4th, okay? When you were in Algebra 1, you should have learned the rules that when you divide like bases, you subtract your exponents. So if I'm doing x to the 6th divided by x to the 4th, that's going to leave me with x squared. So because you're going to be dividing, that's why you want the smallest exponent. That way it works out. Okay? So what we're going to do is, if I have 2x to the 4th minus 4x squared, we're first going to identify what our GCF is for our number and our variables, and then we're going to divide each term by that. Okay, so if I have a 2 and a negative 4, what could I take out? A 2, and then x to the 4th and x squared, my smallest exponent would be x squared. So I'm going to take each term and divide it by 2x squared. And when I write my answer, I have to bring that GCF out front because that is still part of your answer. Okay, and then what we get when we divide will be in parentheses. So 2x to the 4th divided by 2x squared would leave me with what? X squared. And then negative 4x squared divided by 2x squared would leave me with negative 2. Because x squared over x squared would cancel. Okay, so 2x squared times x squared minus 2 would be my answer. And you can always distribute that GCF back in and check to make sure it gives you your original. Okay? So then now I've got a negative 4x to the 5th minus 6x cubed plus 14x squared. Anytime you have a leading negative, take out the negative as your GCF. Now you might still have a number that you have to take out, but you need to include the negative. You never want to factor something with a leading coefficient that's negative. Okay? So between 4, 6, and 14, what could I take out? So it would be a negative 2, and then x to the 5th, x cubed, x squared would be x squared. So I divide everything by a negative 2x squared, and I bring that GCF down. So negative 4x to the 5th divided by negative 2x squared would give me what? 2x cubed, very good. And then negative 6x cubed divided by negative 2x squared would give you 3x. And then 14x squared divided by negative 2x squared, negative 7. Okay? So then our next section will cover the difference of two squares. So anytime you have two terms, your only options to factor are going to be GCF and or difference of two squares. That's it. Okay, so for it to be the difference of two squares, you have to have two terms. It says difference, so you have to have a minus. The exponent has to be even, and you have to have perfect square numbers. Okay, so you should be able to recognize your perfect squares by now. I don't give you anything huge that you shouldn't be able to recognize. Okay. So if you do have the difference of two squares after you check for a GCF, then you're going to use this formula, a squared minus b squared equals a minus b times a plus b. And all that is you're taking the square root of each term these two sets of parentheses, the binomials, they'll be the exact same except one's a plus, one's a minus. That's it. Okay? You cannot factor the sum of two squares unless you have a GCF that's a negative that changes it to a difference. Okay? So if I have x squared minus 4, I do not have a coefficient in front of x squared, so I don't have to check for a GCF. I only check for GCFs when I do have coefficients. Okay? Because this is just a 1, so it's not going to do anything for me. Okay? So I've got my even exponent. I've got my minus. This is a perfect square, so it is the difference of two squares. So I know they're going to split into two parentheses. One's a plus, one's a minus. X squared will always split x and x. And then I take the square root of 4, which is 2. So it's x plus 2, x minus 2. And that would be my factored form. So if I FOILed it, x squared minus 2x plus 2x, that cancels. And then I've got my minus 4. So I'm good. Okay. So then I have 4x squared minus 9. Between a 4 and a 9, I don't have a GCF. So I double check to make sure it's perfect squares, and I can factor that, which it is. So I'm going to split two parentheses. One's a plus, one's a minus. If I take the square root of 4, that's 2, and then I'm going to split my x squared, x and x, so that becomes 2x and 2x. And then square root of 9 is 3. So I have 2x plus 3 and 2x minus 3. Okay. So now I've got x squared plus 16. I have an even exponent, I have a perfect square, I have my two terms, but I have a plus. There is nothing that will multiply to give me a positive 16 that will cancel that middle term. Because what's happening each time is you get a negative 6x plus 6x, those are canceling. That's why this is always the difference of two squares, because you're multiplying a positive and negative. They have to be opposite signs to cancel. Here is a positive, so they would have to be the same sign. That would never cancel. So if you can't factor it, it's prime. Excuse me. So then I have 4x to the 5th plus 16x squared, x cubed. So between 4 and 16, I could take out what? And x to the 5th and x cubed, I could take out. So it leaves me with 4x cubed times what? X squared plus 4. Now, I would check, can I factor x squared plus 4? No. If it were a minus, then I would keep going. But I can't do anything, so that is my factored form. I could only take out a GCF. Y'all good with that? Okay. Alright, when we do trinomials, something like this is what you would have factored in geometry. So, when you have x squared plus bx plus c, and you do not have a coefficient, it's equal to 1. Anytime you are factoring a trinomial, whether you have a coefficient or not, when that last term is positive, that's going to tell me my factors are going to be the same sign. So you're always taking factors of your last to give you your middle term. So if it's a positive, they're going to be the same sign, and they're going to add together to give you your middle term. If you have a negative, so it's minus c, then they're going to be different signs. And they're going to subtract to give you your middle term. That's important to knowing which factors to choose, because some factors or some numbers have factors that will subtract to give you the same number as if a difference that were to add. So you have to be careful and know which one's which. Now, because if you have a minus and you have different signs, you have to know which one's positive, which one's negative. So I always tell my students the larger factor takes the sign of the middle. If you can remember that, it makes it a whole lot easier, and more than likely your signs won't be wrong. Okay, so if we look at our first example, I've got x squared minus 5x minus 6. I want factors of a 6 to give me a 5. But it's a minus 6, so that tells me they're going to be different signs. I'm going to subtract. Okay, so I know it's going to split into two sets of parentheses. I know I'm going to have an x and an x, and because they're different, one's going to be positive, one's going to be minus. Okay, so factors of 6 are 1 and 6, 2 and 3. If you're not paying attention to them being different, you might choose 2 and 3, because 2 and 3 would give you 5, but this is telling me they have to be different. So then 1 and 6 would be the ones to subtract to give me 5. Okay, but I want a negative 5. So it's either going to be 1 and negative 6 or negative 1 and 6. So to prevent you from always having to write it and think about it, this is where this comes in. Your larger factor, so my 6, takes the sign of the middle. The middle is negative, so the 6 is negative, the 1 is positive. And there's my factored form. And you can check it by FOILing. You get x squared minus 6x plus 1x minus 6, which gives me my negative 5x that I need in the middle. Okay. So then my next one, x squared minus 19x plus 48. My 48 is a plus, so that means they're going to be the same. I'm going to add to get 19. So my factors of 48, that will give me 19, are what? I have 1 and 48, 2 and 24, 3 and 16. 3 and 16 will give me my 19. Okay, so my two sets of parentheses, what are my signs going to be? They're both negative. So x minus 3, x minus 16. And you do not have to list all of your factors. Bless you. You don't have to list all of your factors. If you know which two go together, then that's what you put. Okay? Now, when you have a coefficient that's greater than 1, okay, you're going to have a few different steps. Your first step is to still check for a GCF, because now you have a coefficient, now there's a possibility you have a GCF. Okay? Once you do that, if you don't have a GCF, you're going to multiply your first times your last term. Okay, so 2, 11, and 5 don't have a GCF, so I multiply first times last, my A times C. 2 times 5 is 10. That's now the number you want to find factors of. Okay? I want to find factors of 10 that give me this 11. What do I know about my signs? Are they going to be the same or different? They're going to be the same. So they're going to add. What factors are going to add to give me 11? 1 and 10. Now we said they're the same. What sign are they? Negative. Now if I just stopped there and I did x minus 1, x minus 10, if I FOILed that, it would never give me a 2x squared. Okay? In my first step, I multiplied. I have to undo that because that's really going to give me this factor right here. So once you get your two factors, you're going to divide both of them by your a value that you multiplied by. Okay, you got to undo it. So I'm going to divide both by 2. If I can simplify, I would. Negative 1 over 2 doesn't simplify, but negative 10 over 2 simplifies to negative 5. But with these steps, I want a denominator, so I'm going to put it over 1. The reason I want a denominator is because the denominator is always going to be your coefficient of x. So your bottom, this is how I do it. The bottom always takes an x. I go ahead and put my x right there, so I don't get confused when I write it in factored form. Okay? Your denominator is the coefficient of x. Your numerator is your constant. Okay? So that means I'm going to set up my 2x minus 1 times, my next one would be x minus 5. Now when I FOIL it, 2x squared minus 10 minus 1 gives me my negative 11, and then I get my positive 5. Now I have it correct. Okay, so you multiply first times last after you check for a GCF. Get your two factors, divide by a, bottom takes the x. Okay? So if I have example 10, negative 4x squared plus 10x plus 6, I need to look for a GCF. What would my GCF be? It would be a negative 2 because I have a leading negative. You never want to factor something with a negative. Okay, so then I take out my negative 2 and I multiply that by whatever I get by dividing, so that gives me 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. Then I look at what's inside my parentheses, and I'm going to factor that. It's no longer going to be a 4. I'm now multiplying 2 times negative 3. And that's going to give me a negative 6. With it being negative, what does that tell me about my signs? They're different. They're going to subtract. So what two factors of 6 subtract to give me a negative 5? 1 and negative 6. My larger factor takes the sign of the middle, which is negative. So then I have to divide them. I multiplied by 2, so I'm dividing by 2. Okay? So 1 over 2 doesn't simplify, bottom takes the x. Negative 6 over 2 is the same as negative 3. Put it over 1, bottom takes the x. Okay, so I bring down this negative 2. I never leave off my GCF, ever. Alright, and then that becomes 2x plus 1 times x minus 3. Y'all okay with that? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to put everything together. We are going to factor however we need to, but it's now an equation. Okay, so the difference between now with an equation versus here when it was just an expression, you cannot solve an expression. So if any point in your work you drop off the equal 0, you're getting points taken off because you've taken it from an equation and changed it to an expression, which you cannot solve an expression. So if you solve an expression, you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you're getting points taken off. Okay? So leave the equal 0 every single step of the way. Okay? So if I have 2x squared minus 11x plus 5 equals 0, do I have a GCF? No. So I'm going to start by multiplying first times last, which is 10. Factors of 10, that will give me 11. Are they going to add or subtract? This is telling me they're the same sign, so they're going to add. They're just both negative. Okay, so negative 1 and negative 10 will give me my negative 11. What do I do with that? Divide by 2. Negative 1/2 doesn't simplify, so the bottom takes the x. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5 over 1. Bottom takes the x. So this becomes 2x minus 1 times x minus 5 equals 0. I have to see that. I have to see your factored form equal to 0. Then we're going to separate each x term and solve for x. So I'm going to set 2x minus 1 equal to 0, and x minus 5 equal to 0. I have to see this. Okay? Now, if I have 2x minus 1 equal to 0, how am I going to solve that? Add my 1, so 2x equals 1. Then divide by 2, and x equals 1/2. X minus 5 equals 0, what do I do? And so x equals 5. I have to see this step, I have to see this step, and then I see your answer. If you don't show me any part of this, you're getting points taken off. Okay? We'll continue when y'all get back from lunch. So for our next example, we've got 12x to the 4th plus 75x squared equals 60x cubed. If I need it equal to 0, I need to move this 60x cubed over to the left. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 60x cubed. And when you rewrite it, make sure you have the right order, going from highest exponent down to your lowest. So it's going to be 12x to the 4th minus 60x cubed plus 75x squared equals 0. And then, what do we need to check for? GCF. What would be my GCF? 3 what? X squared. Very good. Alright, so when I take out my 3x squared, I'm left with 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. Remember to keep your GCF out front. Okay, so now I need to factor, so I'm going to multiply 4 times 25 and I get 100. Factors of 100 to give me 20. They're both going to be negative, so negative 10, negative 10. And what do I do with that? Divide by 4. They simplify to negative 5 halves. Bottom takes the x. So I have 3x squared times 2x minus 5 times 2x minus 5 equals 0. Okay, so now to solve for my x, I need to separate everything, set it equal to 0. So including my GCF. So 3x squared equals 0. 2x minus 5 equals 0. 2x minus 5 equals 0. Alright, with this 3x squared equals 0, I would divide by 3, x squared equals 0. And then what would I need to do? Square root it, but either way, x is equal to what? 0. Now, there was an x squared, so technically there's 2 solutions, so we put a ds there for double solution. Okay, so if you have something squared, that would be double solution. If I have it to the 3rd power, what would that be? A triple solution. What about 4 or 5? The quadruple and quintuple solution. I'm just going to put QS. Because on the key, when you're working, you might see a TS or QS, and that's where that's coming from. Okay? I want you to try to do 16, and then we're going to check how you did. Okay, you should have added your 4x to 8x to get 16x squared plus 12x plus 2 equals 0. Then what did you do? Okay, take out what as your GCF? So that gives me okay, when you factor it, what do you get? Okay, so then set 2x plus 1 equal to 0, 4x plus 1 equal to 0. This 2 equal to 0 doesn't do anything because I don't have an x, and 2 isn't equal to 0. Okay, so if you have an x, then set it equal to 0. If you don't, then don't worry about that GCF. Okay, so then my 2x value should be x equals what? And? Very good. Okay, what about 17? What do I need to do for that? Move it over to the left, so I get 125x to the 6th minus 45x to the 4th equals 0. And then what? GCF. What's my GCF? 5x to the 4th. And that leaves me with 25x squared minus 9 equals 0. What can I do with 25x squared minus 9? It's two terms, so what's that called? It's the difference of two squares. Okay, so I'm going to drop down my 5x to the 4th. That factors. I take the square root of 25x squared, and that gives me 5x. One's going to be plus, one's going to be minus. Square root of 9 is 3. Oh, I never even finished this one. This was x equals 5/2. And I would have put double solution because there's two of them. If there's two of the exact same thing, you can solve it once, do double solution. Sorry. But on here, 5x plus 3 and 5x minus 3 are not the same thing, so you cannot do double solution there. Alright, so I'm going to set 5x to the 4th equal to 0, 5x plus 3 equal to 0, 5x minus 3 equal to 0. If I divided this by 5, x to the 4th would equal 0. X would equal to 0, but what do I need with it? QS for quadruple because it's a 4. And then, what are my other two x values? Negative 3/5 and positive 3/5. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. Now we're going to talk about quadratic forms. Hold on. Okay, so quadratic forms is what I usually call U substitution. So what we've been doing is factoring when it's x squared plus bx plus c. Okay? But now we have x to the 4th minus 2x squared minus 3 equals 0. Typically, if you see x to the 4th, you're going to want to take out a GCF. But I can't do that because I don't have an x with this 3. So this is where we're going to do U substitution. Okay? So what we're trying to do is take this x to the 4th and this x squared and put it in the form of x squared and x. A squared term and a single term. Okay? So what you do is you line up your squared term and your single term, but they're now going to be u's. So this is like u squared minus 2u minus 3 equals 0. So it gives you your squared term, it gives you your single term, but now you're taking x squared and replacing it with u. So if x squared equals u, if I take u and square it, that means I'm taking x squared and squaring it, and what does that give me? X to the 4th. Okay? So you're replacing x to the 4th with u squared. X squared with u. You just need to make it look like u squared and a u. Okay? So then you factor it like normal, you just have a u. So if I have x to the 4th minus 5x squared plus 6 equals 0, then I'm going to make it u squared minus 5u plus 6 equals 0. Okay? So now I factor this. Factors of 6 to give me a negative 5. What are they? You got to make sure you know if they're adding or subtracting. They're going to be adding. So u minus 2 and u minus 3 equals 0. Alright? So I still do u minus 2 equals 0, u minus 3 equals 0. I solve by adding 2 and you get u equals 2. Solve by adding 3, u equals 3. Okay? Now, we need to throw our x back in. So what did I say u was equal to? U lines up with x squared. So if u is equal to x squared, then we're plugging that back in. X squared is equal to 2. And x squared is equal to 3. Okay, so that's why it's called, well, that's why I call it u substitution. That's what I learned it as. I don't remember quadratic forms. That's the mathematical term for it. I just say u substitution because that's what it is. Okay, so now we need to solve for x. So if it's being squared, what do? Square root it. Square root both sides. Do y'all remember what you need when you have a square root? When you're solving? X equals?
I just realized I had all my stuff.
Plus or minus square root of 2. Y'all know why we do a plus or minus? So if I took the square root of 4, what do you know that to be? 2. Alright? Well, so that's because 2 times 2 is equal to 4. But what does negative 2 times negative 2 give you? Also a positive 4. So that's where your plus and minus comes from, because I can take two negatives, multiply it by each other, and I still get a positive. So anytime you take the square root, which we're going to do this some more in part 2, but anytime you take the square root, you always have a plus and minus before that radical because of that rule right there. Okay? So then now x squared equals 3. I take the square root, and x is equal to what? Plus or minus 3. Square root of 3. My bad. So if you wanted to, you could store the square root of 2 for x and type in your original, make sure it gives you 0. Store the negative, store the positive square root of 3, store the negative. You've got 4 answers to check if you want to. Okay? Y'all understand how I substituted the u's? Okay, so if I have x to the 4th minus 17x squared plus 16 equals 0, I'm going to substitute my u's back in, and it becomes u squared minus 17u plus 16 equals 0. So I factor that. Factors of 16 to give me negative 17 are going to be what? U minus 1 and u minus 16. So u minus 1 equals 0 and u minus 16 equals 0. So u is equal to 1 and u is equal to 16. Now that I've got it down to that, what do I plug back in for u? X squared. So x squared equals 1 and x squared equals 16. So I take the square root. X equals plus or minus 1. Square root of 1. 1 is a perfect number. So any root of 1 is 1. And then square root 16 and x is equal to okay, y'all good with that? So now I no longer have x to the fourth and x, I now have x in the square root of x. So the way we know if we can still do this, can you take square root of x, square it, and does it give me x? Well, anytime I square a square root, that just undoes it, leaving me with x. So I can. So even though it looks weird, I'm still going to make it u squared minus 5u minus 6 equals 0. But now what is my u going to be equal to? U is now going to be the square root of x. Okay? So I'm going to factor using my u. What's it going to be? U plus 1, u minus 6. There are different times they got to subtract. So u plus 1 equals 0. U minus 6 equals 0. U equals negative 1. U equals positive 6. But now what do I replace? Square root of x equals negative 1. Square root of x equals 6. So if it's the square root of x, how am I going to solve for x? Square it. I square both sides. X equals what? 1. Do I need a plus or minus there? Why not? It's positive no matter what, because anything squared is positive. Okay, so then square this side, and x is equal to 36. Now, before we highlight, anytime you have a radical, a square root, you have to check for extraneous solutions. Okay, so we're going to take our 1 and store it for x. And then we're going to type in our original x minus 5 square root of x. Make sure you get out of the radical using your right arrow. Minus 6. It doesn't give me 0. So it's extraneous. Okay? And then I'm going to take 36, store for x. That gives me 0. So x equals 36 is my answer. Okay? Now this next one, 2x minus, this should be a 4. So 2x minus 4 square root of x plus 2 equals 0. So I'm going to do 2u squared minus 4u plus 2 equals 0. And what am I going to do to factor that? GCF of? So u squared minus 2u plus 1 equals 0. So what does that factor into? u minus 1, u minus 1. So u minus 1 equals 0. U is equal to 1. But what is u? Square root of x. Yes, I heard that. Technically, that is a double solution. So then, to get rid of it, I square. To get rid of the radical, I square. So x is equal to 1. Okay, so we could do this in our head, or we can just type it. Let's just type it. So 2x minus 4 square root of x plus 2 equals 0. So I know I'm good with that. Okay. Now this next one, I have 3x minus 10x to the 1/2 power plus 3 equals 0. What does this mean? X to the 1/2 is the same as the square root of x. X to the 1/3 is the cube root of x. X to the 1/5 is the 5th root of x. Okay, so that's just another way to write it. So I'm still going to do my 3u squared minus 10u plus 3 equals 0. And what do I need to do? I don't have a GCF. First times last. 3 times 3 gives me 9. Factors of 9 to give me a 10. Negative 1, negative 9. And I do what with those? Divide them by 3. Negative 1 over 3 doesn't simplify. This time the u, bottom takes the u. If you do an x, that's okay. Negative 9 over 3 is negative 3 over 1. Bottom takes the u. So this turns into 3u minus 1 and u minus 3 equals 0. So 3u minus 1 equals 0. U minus 3 equals 0. What are my u values? 1/3 and 3. But what is u equal to? Square root of x. So I'm going to square both sides. X is going to equal what? 1/9 square. And x equals 9. Okay? And then we check it. 1/9 store for x. 3x minus 10 square root of x plus 3 gives me 0. 9 store for x also gives me 0. Y'all good with that? Okay. So you will have a quiz over 4.1 after I teach part 2 also. So it will be part 1 and part 2 together for your quiz. Okay?